So we've talked a lot about what elasticity is, how to measure it, how elasticity tells us the relationship between price and total revenue, by telling us how responsive consumers are to a change in price. We haven't really talked specifically. We've alluded to things that affect how elastic demand for a product is. And I can make a list. It's really there's really just one big thing, and this is not an exhaustive list of things to put under it, but the idea is that the more and closer substitutes there are, the more elastic demand for the product, which should make sense, right? If there's a whole bunch of substitutes, if there's a whole bunch of other people making the same thing, then if you raise your price, people are like, oh, I've got a lot of other choices. I'm going to go somewhere else. If the price, if the Chevron at Ben Holt and I-5 raises the price on gas, well, I could go across the street to the Arco, or I could go to the 7-Eleven right on the other side of the freeway. There's a lot of substitutes right there, plus right down the road. So in the retail gas sector, there's a whole bunch of competitors. So yeah, they do have different prices because people like them for different reasons, but there is a fair degree amount of elasticity amongst gas stations. So the demand for that particular Chevron may be fairly elastic because there are a lot of competitors. On the other hand, demand for gas in general is not very elastic because there aren't that many substitutes for gas, right? And so if the price of oil goes up, so the price of gas everywhere goes up, consumers are going to decrease their consumption of gas, but not that much. That said, the more time that passes, the more time you have to find substitutes, there typically is a greater responsiveness to any given change in price. So if the price of gas goes up and stays up, you may decrease your consumption of gas a little at first. You may say, oh, we're not going to take that drive up into the foothills, or you may combine your errands. But if the price of gas stays really high for a while, and we saw this happen when the price of gas went up a while back and stayed high for a long time, people started trading in their SUVs for more fuel efficient cars. The demand for hybrid cars went up significantly. People found more and different ways to not use gas. They found more substitutes as they had more time to do it. So for any price increase, the more time that passes, the greater the degree of responsiveness, which should make sense. Or anything, I should say circumstance here, sort of, because if a good is a necessity, that kind of means it has no close substitutes. You have to have it. You have to have this particular drug or you're going to die. Then demand's pretty inelastic. Unfortunately, not perfectly inelastic, because some people just can't afford drugs when they get really expensive and they do die. But if in some cases a product may not be a necessity in some circumstances and it may in other circumstances. I'm thinking about snow chains for your tires, right? So if you're down here in the valley and you're thinking, oh, I may go up to the mountains, maybe I'll buy chains, and you look around, and I don't know what the price is. It's been a while since I bought chains, but if you're up in Tahoe and it's starting to snow a little bit, the price of chains probably is going to be higher. And if it's starting to snow a lot, it may be higher. And then if you get stuck on the side of I-80 and they say you can't go any further without chains, it's pretty much a necessity then. And then you really are not going to be very responsive to price. You're going to pretty much pay what the price is because you don't have any other choice. And so in some circumstances, so it's not just this good is elastic or this good is inelastic, but in certain circumstances, you may be a lot more responsive to price. And in certain circumstances, you may say, I'm not responsive at all. I'm going to have to pay whatever the price is. So like I said, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it does, it's just an illustration of the sorts of things that can affect the elasticity of demand. And firms, like I said, need to understand the elasticity of demand, and policymakers need to understand the elasticity of demand and think about how elastic demand for the product is, because that's going to affect the impact of things that they do, like imposing taxes. Or, for instance, a good example of this is in Philadelphia, and I believe it was Chicago. I read about two different places that have really significant commuter rail systems. So a lot of people take the train into work every day. And so they wanted to make more money, so they said, let's raise our fares. So were they assuming demand is elastic or inelastic? They wanted to increase their revenue, so they raised their fares. Yeah, so they're thinking demand's inelastic. They raised their price. Maybe a few people will stop riding, but people still have to go to work, and so we'll raise our fares, we'll make more money. And they did. They raised their fares and they made more money. Yay them. Demand was inelastic. Until about a year had passed. So let's say, I'm making this up, but let's say it was March and they raised their fares, and in April, their revenue was higher in March than in March. So they're like, yay, it worked, our revenue went up. Then by the next March, their revenue was lower than it had been to start with. People responded a lot. Once they had a whole year to respond, they may have bought cars. They may have found other ways to commute. They might have started commuting by bicycle. They may have found somebody to carpool with. They may have moved closer to work. There's a lot of ways people could respond when they were given more time to respond. So demand was inelastic in the short run, and their revenues went up, but got much more responsive as more time passed, and their revenue actually went down. And so you really need to understand and think about how elastic demand is, because the impact of your policy could have significantly different effects depending on how elastic your demand is. So you need to think about these factors. Another good example that I like was in Washington, D.C., which is a small city, right? And it's surrounded, if you're not familiar with the geography, it's surrounded on all sides except for a little bit of water. The rest of it is surrounded by by Maryland and Virginia. So it's just a little city, and I can't draw, but here's Virginia, and here's Maryland. And so basically it's a tiny area surrounded by two other states. So in their wisdom, the City Council of DC, this was a long time ago, this was back in the 80s, but it's still a fun example. They wanted to make more revenue, so they raised the tax on gasoline in the district. What do you think happened? You can't be anywhere in the district and be more than a few miles away from another state. So if you raise the tax on gasoline significantly, just in the District of Columbia, most people aren't going to buy their gas there. And so they raised the tax to increase their revenue, and their tax revenue fell by like 30% or something like that. It was really, really dramatic because they didn't think about there were a lot of really close competitors really nearby. And so they didn't consider the elasticity of their tax base. And if you don't think about how elastic is demand for this, it can really give you unintended consequences. So it's something that, as firms, you have to pay attention to it and think about how elastic demand for your product is, but also as policymakers. Or another good example, if you think about a drug, let's say heroin, and let's say we want people to stop using heroin because that would be good, right? And so, and you think, well, I know supply and demand. We've got a demand curve, we've got a supply curve, we've got Q and we've got P. So you slap it up here because you've taken intro econ and you know what supply and demand looks like. And so you say, let's do a hardcore supply side intervention where we crack down on all the drug dealers and all the drug importers, and just a full on hardcore press where we significantly decrease the supply of this drug. And if we can decrease the supply of the drug, then maybe you can't get rid of it entirely, but a lot fewer people will use the drug. The price will go up a little, and a lot fewer people will use it. So this was heroin. And this was what we wanted to happen. Fewer people are using heroin, yay. And I know that because I have my supply and demand diagram, so I can see that if I can decrease the supply significantly, then the quantity transacted in the market will fall significantly. Except, this probably isn't what the demand for heroin looks like. The demand for heroin, what do you think, is more elastic or less elastic? More responsive to a price change or less responsive to a price change? Yeah, probably a lot less. The demand for heroin, I've never used heroin, but from what I understand, it's highly addictive. And so demand is really quite inelastic. Though you raise the price, it's not like people are like, oh, heroin's a little bit more expensive, let me just, do something else today instead. That's not typically how it works from what I understand. So if you have the same supply curve and the same initial quantity and price, and then we did the same thing, we said, okay, let's have this really strong supply side intervention, decrease the supply, try to make about the same decrease in supply, decrease supply, big supply side intervention, shifting in by that much. the quantity is not going to fall very much at all. The price is going to go up, but a supply side intervention is not going to have a very significant effect. It's going to have a bigger effect probably on price. There's less available, so the price of what's available is going to go up, but also people are going to, it's just not going to follow. People are going to be willing to pay enough that supply is not going to be affected as much, because other people will step in because the price is going to be so high and the quantity is not really going to fall. If demand's really inelastic, supply side interventions are not going to have a really significant effect on the quantity transacted. And so just by thinking about the nature of the good and thinking about the nature of the elasticity of demand for the product tells you, if you really want to decrease consumption in the heroin market, you really probably need some significant demand side interventions, shifting that demand curve in, because shifting the supply is likely to just raise the price higher. And if you really need your heroin and the price is a lot higher, often you'll do illegal things to get that money. And so instead of decreasing consumption, you end up increasing crime. And so again, a simple supply and demand diagram can say, oh, so decreasing supply will work. But if you understand the elasticity of demand, that can tell you maybe that's not the best policy. And so these are just a few little examples, but they're illustrative of, it's not just firms that need to understand the elasticity of demand, but anything that you're trying to do policy-wise, you have to understand elasticity, because that tells you what the effects are going to be. And the effects may be very different depending on how responsive people are, as these people in the examples that I gave you had found out.